Remington Harrow, a successful software engineer, and his wife Cordelia, a talented interior designer, were the picture of marital bliss to their friends and neighbors. Their home, with its manicured lawn and white picket fence, stood as a testament to their seemingly perfect life. But beneath the surface, a dark current was stirring. Remington's growing fascination with a taboo fantasy would set in motion a chain of events that would shatter their idyllic existence and end in tragedy. What began as a consensual exploration of desires would spiral into a maelstrom of jealousy, betrayal, and ultimately murder. Remington Harrow was born in 1985 to a middle-class family in Eugene. From an early age, he displayed a keen intellect and a fascination with computers. His parents, both educators, nurtured his interests, and by the time he entered high school, Remington was already coding his own programs. Despite his academic prowess, he struggled socially, often feeling awkward and out of place among his peers. Cordelia Astor, born in 1987, grew up in a wealthy family in Seattle, Washington. The youngest of 3 children, she was vivacious and creative from the start. Her parents, successful real estate developers, provided her with every opportunity, including art classes and interior design courses. Their paths crossed in 2005 at Reed College in Portland. Remington, a junior computer science major, literally bumped into Cordelia, a freshman art student, in the campus library. He was immediately smitten by her radiant smile and effortless charm. Cordelia, in turn, found herself drawn to Remington's quiet intensity and brilliant mind. Their courtship was a whirlwind of intellectual discussions, late-night coding sessions where Cordelia would sketch while Remington typed, and explorations of Portland's eclectic art scene. Despite their different backgrounds and personalities, they found in each other a perfect complement. They married in 2009, shortly after Cordelia's graduation. The wedding, held in a picturesque vineyard in the Willamette Valley, was a joyous affair that seemed to portend a bright future. Remington had already secured a high-paying job at a tech startup in Portland, while Cordelia began to make a name for herself in the city's competitive interior design market. For the first few years of their marriage, life seemed perfect. They bought their dream home in Oak, traveled the world, and built a wide circle of friends. Remington's career soared as he climbed the corporate ladder, eventually becoming a senior engineer at a tech firm. Cordelia's design business flourished, with her work featured in several magazines. From the outside, the Harrows appeared to have it all: successful careers, a beautiful home, and a strong, loving marriage. But as they entered their 30s, subtle cracks began to form in their seemingly flawless facade, setting the stage for the tumultuous events to come. As the Harrows approached their 10th wedding anniversary, a restlessness began to creep into their relationship. The passion that had once burned so brightly had dimmed to a comfortable but sometimes monotonous glow. Remington, always introspective, found himself increasingly drawn to online forums and discussions about alternative sexual lifestyles. It started innocently enough, a curiosity about what other couples did to spice up their love lives. But as Remington delved deeper into these virtual communities, he became particularly fascinated by the concept of cuckolding. The idea of watching his wife with another man, of being a voyeur to her pleasure, awakened something within him. At first, Remington kept these thoughts to himself, ashamed and confused by the intensity of his desires. He would stay up late, ostensibly working, but in reality consuming every piece of cuckold-related content he could find. Cordelia, perceptive as ever, sensed the change in her husband. She noticed his distraction, the way his eyes would sometimes glaze over during their conversations, the increased frequency of his late nights at the computer. Concerned, she gently probed, asking if everything was all right, if work was becoming too stressful. Finally, after weeks of internal struggle, Remington decided to broach the subject with Cordelia. One evening, over a bottle of wine, he haltingly confessed his newfound interest. He spoke of his desires, his curiosity about exploring this fantasy, all the while watching Cordelia's face for signs of disgust or rejection. To his surprise and relief, Cordelia didn't recoil. Instead, she listened with an open mind, asking thoughtful questions about what exactly appealed to him about this scenario. While she expressed initial reservations, she also admitted to a certain intrigue. The idea of being desired by another man, of being the center of attention, held its own allure. This conversation marked a turning point in their marriage. What had been a private fantasy for Remington was now out in the open, a possibility to be explored together. Neither of them could have predicted the profound impact this revelation would have on their lives or the dangerous path it would ultimately lead them down. The Harrows' foray into the world of cuckolding began cautiously. They set ground rules, discussed boundaries, and agreed to take things slowly. But finding the right person to introduce into their marriage proved challenging. They wanted someone attractive and charismatic, but also discreet and respectful of their arrangement. Enter Thaddeus Blackwood. Cordelia met him at a charity art auction in downtown Portland. Tall, with piercing green eyes, Thaddeus exuded a magnetic charm that drew people to him. As the owner of a successful art gallery, he moved effortlessly through Portland's cultural elite, his wit and knowledge making him the center of attention at any gathering. Cordelia was immediately drawn to Thaddeus's sophisticated aura. They spent the evening in animated conversation about emerging artists and the latest trends in interior design. When Thaddeus casually mentioned being unattached and open to new experiences, Cordelia felt a spark of excitement. She relayed her encounter to Remington that night, watching his eyes light up as she described Thaddeus. They agreed that he might be the perfect candidate for their exploration. Remington encouraged Cordelia to nurture the connection, his excitement palpable. Over the next few weeks, Cordelia and Thaddeus met for coffee several times, ostensibly to discuss potential collaborations between his gallery and her design firm. Each time, Cordelia returned home to regale Remington with stories of their encounters, stoking the flames of his fantasy. Finally, after a particularly flirtatious meeting, Cordelia decided it was time to broach the subject with Thaddeus. To her surprise and delight, he was intrigued by the proposition. He admitted to having participated in similar arrangements before and understood the delicacy required. With Thaddeus on board, the stage was set for the Harrows to turn fantasy into reality. Little did they know that this decision would set in motion a series of events that would irrevocably change their lives. The night of the first encounter arrived with a mix of nervous energy and excited anticipation. Remington and Cordelia had spent weeks planning every detail, from the ambient lighting in their bedroom to the bottle of expensive champagne chilling in an ice bucket. Thaddeus arrived at 8 p.m. sharp, looking dashing in a tailored charcoal suit. He brought with him a bouquet of exotic flowers for Cordelia and a rare bottle of scotch for Remington, a gesture that impressed them both with its thoughtfulness. The evening began in the living room with drinks and light conversation. Thaddeus regaled them with stories from the art world, his charisma on full display. Cordelia, dressed in a slinky black dress, laughed at his jokes and touched his arm with increasing frequency. Remington watched from his armchair, a tumbler of scotch in hand, his heart racing with every interaction between his wife and their guest. As the night progressed and the alcohol flowed, the atmosphere grew charged with sexual tension. Finally, with a meaningful look at Remington, Cordelia took Thaddeus by the hand and led him upstairs. In the bedroom, Remington settled into a corner armchair as Cordelia and Thaddeus began to kiss passionately. When Thaddeus and Cordelia finally fell onto the bed, their bodies entwined, Remington felt a potent mix of arousal and an unexpected twinge of jealousy. The encounter itself was intense and passionate. Remington watched, transfixed, as his fantasy played out before his eyes. The reality was more visceral, more overwhelming than he had imagined. Afterwards, as they all lay spent and silent, Remington felt a complex swirl of emotions. There was satisfaction, certainly. His long-held fantasy had been realized, but there was also a nagging sense of unease, a feeling that something fundamental had shifted. Thaddeus left shortly after, with promises to stay in touch. As Remington and Cordelia lay in bed discussing the evening's events in hushed, excited tones, neither could have predicted how this first encounter would set the stage for the tragedy to come. They had opened Pandora's box, and there would be no closing it again. Encouraged by the success of their first foray into cuckolding, they eagerly arranged more meetings with Thaddeus. What had started as a monthly indulgence quickly became weekly. Each encounter seemed to push the boundaries further, with Thaddeus staying longer, the sessions growing more intense and intimate. Remington's role began to evolve as well. Cordelia said in an interview that while he was initially content to watch from afar, he found himself drawn closer to the action. Sometimes he would join in, and the dynamics of power and control within their bedroom became increasingly complex. Outside of their encounters, Thaddeus began to integrate more into their lives. He would join them for dinner, accompany Cordelia to art exhibitions, and even spend weekends at their home. His charm and wit made him a delightful companion, and the Harlows found themselves enjoying his company even when intimacy wasn't on the agenda. As spring turned to summer, Remington's initial excitement began to give way to a gnawing sense of discomfort. He started to notice small but significant changes in Cordelia's behavior. She seemed distracted during their alone time, her mind elsewhere. She began to dress up more often, even on days when they had no plans with Thaddeus. One evening, Remington came home early from work to find Cordelia on the phone, speaking in hushed, intimate tones. When she saw him, she quickly ended the call, claiming it was just a client. But Remington couldn't shake the feeling that she had been talking to Thaddeus. In bed, Cordelia's passion seemed to have cooled. She was still enthusiastic during their encounters with Thaddeus, but alone with Remington, she often seemed tired or disinterested. Remington found himself initiating intimacy more often, only to be gently rebuffed. He tried to reassert control over the situation, suggesting they take a break from their arrangement, perhaps go on a vacation, just the two of them. But Cordelia seemed reluctant, always finding reasons to delay or change the subject. His work began to suffer as he spent hours analyzing every interaction, every text message, every glance between Cordelia and Thaddeus. He started checking Cordelia's phone when she wasn't looking, scrutinizing her social media activity, even contemplating following her when she went out alone. Remington knew he was spiraling, but he felt powerless to stop it. The game he had initiated was slipping out of his control, and he was terrified of losing Cordelia. As his anxiety grew, so did his determination to put an end to the situation he had created by any means necessary. The breaking point came on a warm July evening. Remington had planned a romantic dinner at home, hoping to reconnect with Cordelia and discuss his growing concerns. He had left work early, bought her favorite wine, and spent hours preparing an elaborate meal. But as the sun began to set and the candles burned low, Cordelia was nowhere to be seen. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Hours ticked by, the carefully prepared food growing cold on the table. When she finally stumbled in shortly before midnight, her hair disheveled and lipstick smudged, Remington's worst fears seemed confirmed. The argument that ensued was explosive. Remington, his emotions amplified by alcohol and hours of anxious waiting, unleashed all the fears and suspicions he'd been harboring. He accused Cordelia of falling in love with Thaddeus, of making a fool of him, of destroying their marriage. Cordelia, caught off guard and defensive, initially tried to deflect. She claimed she'd lost track of time at a client meeting, that her phone had died. But faced with Remington's relentless questioning and the evidence of her appearance, she finally broke down and admitted she had been with Thaddeus. The confession hit Remington like a physical blow. He had suspected, had feared, but hearing it confirmed shattered something inside him. In that moment, all the excitement and thrill of their arrangement fell away. Cordelia, tears streaming down her face, tried to explain. She loved Remington, she insisted, but Thaddeus made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. She was confused, torn between her loyalty to her husband and her deepening emotions for Thaddeus. Remington, his voice low and dangerous, demanded that she end things with Thaddeus immediately. Cordelia, her own anger rising, refused. This had been Remington's idea in the first place, she argued. He couldn't dictate her feelings or control her relationships. The argument escalated, with both of them saying hurtful things they would later regret. Remington, in a moment of rage, smashed a wine glass against the wall. Cordelia, shocked by this uncharacteristic display of violence, retreated to the guest bedroom, locking the door behind her. Remington spent the night on the couch, his mind racing, unable to sleep. In the days following their confrontation, a chilling calm settled over the Harlow household. Cordelia and Remington moved around each other like ghosts, barely speaking, the tension palpable. Cordelia spent most of her time out of the house, throwing herself into her work and, Remington suspected, meeting with Thaddeus. Remington, for his part, retreated into a dark place within himself. He called in sick to work, spending his days in a haze of alcohol and paranoid thoughts. He scoured Cordelia's computer and phone for evidence of her relationship with Thaddeus, meticulously documenting every text, every call, every unexplained absence. Remington began to fantasize about confronting Thaddeus, about making him pay for destroying his marriage. At first, these were just harmless daydreams, a way to vent his frustration. But as the days wore on and Cordelia grew more distant, these fantasies took on a darker, more violent tone. One afternoon, while Cordelia was at a client meeting, Remington found himself in their garage, holding the heavy wrench he used for home repairs. As he felt its weight in his hand, a chilling thought crossed his mind. It would be so easy to end this, to eliminate the threat to his marriage once and for all. Horrified by the direction of his thoughts, Remington dropped the wrench and fled the garage. But the seed had been planted. As he paced the house, gulping down glasses of whiskey, the idea took root and grew. By the time night fell, what had started as a fleeting, horrifying thought had crystallized into a plan. August 15th dawned hot and humid, the air heavy with the promise of an approaching storm. Remington woke early, his head pounding from another night of heavy drinking, but his resolve unwavering. Today would be the day he confronted Thaddeus, the day he reclaimed control over his life and his marriage. He spent the morning in a feverish state of preparation. He showered, shaved, and dressed with meticulous care, as if preparing for an important business meeting rather than the violent confrontation he was planning. In the garage, he selected the wrench he had held days earlier, wrapping it in a towel and placing it in a nondescript gym bag. Cordelia left for work around 9 a.m., barely acknowledging Remington as she rushed out the door. As soon as she was gone, Remington got into his car and drove to Thaddeus's gallery. He parked across the street, watching as Thaddeus arrived, greeting his employees with his characteristic charm. For hours, Remington sat in his car. As closing time approached, Remington watched Thaddeus bid goodbye to his last customer and begin closing up the gallery. This was the moment he had been waiting for. With shaking hands, he grabbed the gym bag and crossed the street. Thaddeus was locking the gallery door when Remington approached. He turned, surprise flickering across his face before it settled into a wary smile. "Remington," he said, "this is unexpected. Is everything all right?" Remington felt a surge of rage at Thaddeus's casual tone, as if he hadn't been destroying Remington's life for months. Without conscious thought, he swung the gym bag, catching Thaddeus off guard and sending him stumbling back against the gallery door. What followed was a blur of violence and desperation. Remington pulled out the wrench, swinging it wildly as Thaddeus tried to defend himself. But Remington was beyond reason. Every blow was fueled by months of jealousy, insecurity, and rage. When it was over, Remington stood panting over Thaddeus's motionless body, the wrench slick with blood in his trembling hand. The reality of what he had done crashed over him like a tidal wave. He had just killed a man. He had just destroyed his own life in a futile attempt to save it. Remington went through the motions of covering his tracks. He dragged Thaddeus's body into the alley behind the gallery, hiding it behind a dumpster. He wiped down the door handle and any surfaces he might have touched. Then, still in a state of shock, he drove home, the weight of his actions settling over him like a shroud. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke as Remington pulled into his driveway, the rain washing away the blood on his hands, but doing nothing to cleanse his conscience. The hours following the murder passed in a nightmarish blur for Remington. He stumbled into the house, barely making it to the bathroom before violently emptying the contents of his stomach. As the adrenaline wore off, the full impact of his actions hit him. He had killed a man. He was a murderer. Operating on autopilot, Remington set about destroying evidence. He burned his clothes in the backyard fire pit, scrubbed the car clean, and took a shower. When Cordelia came home, Remington had composed himself enough to feign normalcy. He greeted her with forced cheerfulness, suggesting they order takeout and watch a movie. As they sat on the couch, the TV flickering unwatched, Remington's mind raced. He knew it was only a matter of time before Thaddeus's body was discovered. He needed an alibi, a story to tell when the inevitable questions came. He casually mentioned to Cordelia that he had spent the day at home, catching up on work and doing some yard work. He even showed her a small cut on his hand, claiming he had nicked himself while pruning the rose bushes, a cut that had actually come from his struggle with Thaddeus. 2 days after the murder, the news broke. Thaddeus Blackwood, a prominent art dealer and fixture of Portland's cultural scene, had been found dead behind his shop. The police were treating it as a homicide. Remington learned of the discovery while at work, overhearing colleagues discussing the shocking news. He felt the blood drain from his face, his hands shaking so badly he had to excuse himself to the restroom. The investigation moved quickly. Detective Alana Rossi, a veteran of the Police Bureau's Homicide Division, took charge of the case. She and her team combed through Thaddeus's life, interviewing friends, family, and business associates. It didn't take long for them to uncover Thaddeus's relationship with the Harlows. Cordelia, devastated by the news of Thaddeus's death, initially tried to downplay their connection, but faced with evidence from Thaddeus's phone records and witness accounts, she eventually admitted to their affair. When the police came to interview Remington, he was prepared. He expressed shock and sadness at Thaddeus's death, acknowledging that while their arrangement had been unconventional, he had considered Thaddeus a friend. He calmly recounted his movements on the day of the murder, his story aligning perfectly with what he had told Cordelia. Detective Rossi, however, sensed something off about Remington's demeanor. His calm seemed forced, his grief a touch too performative. She made a mental note to dig deeper into his background and movements. As the investigation progressed, the police began to piece together a timeline of Thaddeus's last day. Security footage from nearby businesses showed him entering the gallery in the morning, but never leaving. His last phone call had been to Cordelia, ending abruptly around closing time. The net was slowly closing around Remington. As the days turned into weeks, Cordelia's grief over Thaddeus's death deepened. She threw herself into her work, often staying late at the office, avoiding the stilted silences that now characterized her home life with Remington. At first, Remington's attentiveness in the wake of the tragedy had touched her. He seemed genuinely concerned for her well-being, always ready with a comforting word or a shoulder to cry on. But as time passed, she began to notice inconsistencies in his behavior. Cordelia found herself revisiting the events leading up to Thaddeus's death. She remembered Remington's jealousy, his desperate pleas for her to end the affair. The more she thought about it, the more a terrible suspicion began to take root in her mind. She started paying closer attention to Remington's actions, noting when he left the house, checking his browser history when he wasn't around. She even considered hiring a private investigator, but couldn't bring herself to take that final step. As her suspicions grew, so did her fear. If Remington was capable of what she was beginning to suspect, what else might he be capable of? For the first time in their marriage, Cordelia found herself afraid of her husband, unsure of the man she had promised to love for better or worse. The breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected source. A homeless man known to frequent the alley behind Thaddeus's gallery came forward with information. He claimed to have seen a man, matching Remington's description, entering the alley on the night of the murder, carrying a gym bag. This new lead energized the investigation. Detective Rossi and her team began to scrutinize Remington's movements more closely. They discovered traffic camera footage that contradicted his alibi, showing his car near the gallery around the time of the murder. As the evidence mounted, Remington's behavior became increasingly erratic. He started drinking heavily, snapping at colleagues, and becoming paranoid about being followed. Cordelia, her own suspicions now seeming confirmed, began to distance herself from him, staying with a friend under the guise of needing space to grieve. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when the police, armed with a search warrant, found small traces of blood in Remington's car that matched Thaddeus's DNA. They also discovered the murder weapon, the blood-stained wrench that Remington had hidden in the attic, unable to bring himself to dispose of it completely. On a rainy September morning, nearly a month after Thaddeus's death, Detective Rossi arrived at the Harlow residence with a team of officers. They found Remington sitting in the living room, a half-empty bottle of whiskey beside him. As the detective read him his rights, Remington offered no resistance. In that moment, he felt an odd sense of relief. The game was over. The lies, the fear, the constant vigilance, it could all stop now. Remington Harlow's trial was brief but sensational. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, his confession a rambling account of jealousy, fantasy, and fatal obsession. He was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Cordelia, shattered by the revelation of her husband's actions, filed for divorce shortly after his arrest. She sold their house, unable to live with the memories it held, and moved out of state to start a new life.